Okay.
Munja off my list.
Good morning, everybody. Fergus Dolan here from NALA. Delighted to have you here joining us in our webinar this morning on reading for pleasure and reading together. And I'm joined by my colleague Anne Hegarty, and we're delighted to have Sam Duncan from the UCL Institute of Education in London, and Sam's going to be presenting this morning. So Anne and I'll switch off, and just at the end you can rejoin for questions. I'll come back on, and if you have any questions, type them into the questions stroke chat box and we get on from then. Okay, Sam, over to you.
Lovely. Hi. Hello. So hi. So thanks very much. I'm really happy to be here, and I hope everyone's well. I work at the UCL Institute of Education and focusing on literacy, adult literacy, and my background is as an adult literacy tutor in Scotland and England. And that's a main focus of my interest in how we can work with adults developing their reading and writing. Another part of my work is about researching literacy with a particular focus on understanding literacy across our adult lives. So kind of what reading and writing means to different people, how we live it differently. And what I'm very interested in doing always is joining these two. So examining the relationships between what literacy means to any of us adults in as many different ways as possible, and therefore how we might help adults develop their own reading and writing. So that's one of the relationships that I'm interested in, and I'm going to try and talk a bit about today. And the second relationship is thinking about this idea of reading for pleasure, what it means, and reading together. And thinking really about how reading for pleasure and reading together, I think they're things that lots of people do in different ways in their lives, and there are also ways that we can help adults develop their literacy. So they're reading practices, I would say, and they're also reading pedagogies or ways that we can teach. So what I want to try and do today is bring all these things together, if I can. One thing I've thought about a lot as an adult literacy tutor is, if I want to help an adult with their reading, where do I go for guidance? So there's lots of different reading experts, I think. There's lots of different things published and written about reading processes. But because there's so much, sometimes it can be hard to tell kind of where to go, where to start. And then one way that I think is quite useful starting is actually by thinking very carefully about what any of us are doing when we read, and trying to break it down from there. So this kind of noticing and thinking. So for example, if, this morning I was looking at a letter stroke contract that had come home in my daughter's school bag, where I had to read through and agree to make sure, to tell the school if any of us are ill, to do a test, or to keep in contact. She had to agree to kind of cough in her elbow, things like that. So with that kind of reading practice, how could we break that down? How could we think about that? What am I doing when I read that? And therefore, if I'm working with an adult who wants to be better at reading these things or improve their skills to read those things, what is it exactly that they need to do? So in a sense, this is thinking about a reading practice or something that we do in our lives with reading, being made up of lots of different skills perhaps, or different sub-skills, and how can we understand those? So one of the ways I might do that, I just tried to sketch this out earlier, is thinking, okay, if I'm looking at that letter, what am I actually doing? What is reading for me in this? One of the things is, we could say it's a decoding, or it's a linking of written word with a spoken word. So if I see the word child, C-H-I-L-D, I can link that written word with the spoken word child that I have, that I use, that I know what I mean. So that's that linking. Sometimes we talk about phonic decoding, where we're linking sounds and symbols, or we might think of almost a whole word, like with the, or the name of the school. I probably decode that written symbol with something oral, a kind of something I might say from looking at a whole chunk. I think decoding is also making sense of punctuation, isn't it? Thinking about spacing, layout, the kind of textual features. So that seems to be one thing that many of us do when we're reading many kinds of texts. We're doing a kind of linking process from a written code to the spoken language that we may know well. But I think we're also doing other things, aren't we, where we then understand those words. So I might link the written word child with a spoken word child, but I also need an understanding what does that mean, child? And what does it mean, my child? And I might also be building that meaning of individual words up into sentences, and thinking about how the meanings those are created there. And sometimes, depending on the letter, or we might think about other texts now, we might be building meaning up into paragraphs. There might be a paragraph that talks a bit about things we need as parents to agree to do, and another paragraph that might talk about cooperation, and I kind of understand how those are linked. So what I'm trying to do here, I suppose, is give an example of how we can think as teachers, and we can do this with our learners as well. Think about any type of text we might want to read, or that we might read, and trying to think of what exactly am I doing when I'm reading it? What does it mean to read this particular text? So these are some of the skills. I tried to brainstorm a little bit this morning about what is involved in reading that kind of letter or contract that comes back from a school, but there may be other things, and certainly other reading practices might have other kind of smaller skills. Well, once I think we do that kind of breaking down, then we can think, okay, so if these are the things that most of us do when we're reading this text, or maybe these are things we need to be able to do to be a kind of good or successful reader of that text, well, then how do we develop these? How can I help another adult with that? So this is a kind of an approach, in a sense, that's beneath what I'll try and talk about a bit today. So reading for pleasure is, I think, personally, I find it quite a tricky term, partly because I think it's a term that's used a lot in education and maybe in libraries or official advocacy work. So in more formal situations, it's a term used to describe something that happens absolutely outside of those formal situations, or that we're imagining is outside of those. So I think in our kind of real everyday lives, we would very rarely say, oh yeah, my partner's at the bottom of the garden reading for pleasure, or yeah, I'm going up to bed to do a bit of reading for pleasure. So there's a slight disjuncture, because we're trying in educational terms, perhaps, it's just an idea, to think about something which by its nature is something that we do across the rest of our lives, perhaps, or some people do. I also think it can be a tricky term if we're thinking about, well, what does pleasure mean in here? You know, what kinds of pleasures? And is this about pleasures of escape, pleasures of journeying to other places, pleasures of having a bit of time to yourself, or maybe pleasures of sharing time with other people? It could be pleasures of a particular topic, or pleasures of language. There's many, many different pleasures there. But I think the main pleasure in reading for pleasure is this reading because it pleases you, or reading how it pleases you. So reading when you want to read, excuse me, why you want to read, what you want to read, how you want to read. So I think very much about choice, and reading that's not forced, and you're not told to do it by anyone else. And this can also make it a bit of a complicated concept when we think in educational terms, because we might want to encourage someone to read for pleasure, but forcing them to do then gets away from that kind of pleasure, reading because you want to, because it pleases you. And I think also the other important thing is that reading for pleasure, well, it doesn't always have to be fiction, does it? It doesn't have to be a certain type of text. It's really anything that anyone wants to read. I remember as a child hanging around outside pubs where my dad would go in and go to the toilet, and then he would have to have a drink because he said, oh, you can't use the toilet in a pub without having a drink. And I'd standing outside and I'd see, this going back a while, quite a lot of old men standing at the bar with papers reading sports pages or betting or something. So that's reading for pleasure, isn't it? So reading for pleasure looks different in different situations. Reading for pleasure is something that many people do. It's also something that we can try and harness in our teaching, in our literacy teaching. And so that's something that I'll be looking at today. The second bit then, reading for pleasure, reading together, I tried to trace through, what are the different formations, maybe that's the word, what are the different ways that we can read alone or different ways with others. And you can probably see this 1 to 5 I'm trying to do. So one is, some of our reading is completely by ourselves, alone, but that might be silent, it might be out loud. I'll talk a bit more about that. It might be listening to recording, an audio book, or on the radio, or online of someone reading, and maybe following along, maybe not. So in a sense, that's alone, but that's also with someone, because we're with the text, maybe. Then kind of reading with other people can be in these different ways. So we might have we might know of many instances where we're reading silently on our own or aloud, but on our own, and we come together with others to read and talk in a group because we really want to talk about what's happening, what's that about, what's interesting about it. And there's other times we might sit with others and read, perhaps a little bit out loud all together. Maybe we're taking turns. Maybe we're not. Maybe one person likes reading, another one doesn't. But we're stopping, we're discussing it. That seems to be another kind of reading together. We could also think of one person reading to an audience, maybe discussing, maybe not. And we could think of lots of people all together, all reading the same thing, maybe kind of a reciting or a chanting, discussing or not. And there may be other kind of formations, but these seem to be some of the ways that we can come across reading together in adult life. And I think for each of these, we could think about why people do that. You know, when have we seen that? When have you seen someone do that in your life, and why? Why might they do that? Why is that enjoyable or powerful, or is there something someone's learning from it, or is there some benefits from it? How are they similar or different to each other? And remembering when we went back and looked at this and tried to break reading down into little skills, or into kind of component skills or competencies, each of these might involve slightly different skills or competencies. So for example, if it's one person reading to an audience, then, well, maybe there's skills of projection, use of voice, eye contact, use of body even. Maybe if we're reading together at home and coming together to talk about it, there's other skills involved there about listening to other people's point of view, or about trying to piece together a meaning together. So there are different ways we can read, which might involve slightly different skills that we can think about. I think they're all potentially, all of these, potentially ways of reading for pleasure. So they're potentially ways that people may enjoy their reading and choose to read. So we can look at each of these again as things that people do across their lives. We may not all do all of them, but if we stopped and listened and had a look about, we could probably identify people doing these different reading practices, different forms of reading together that they get something out of. And also these are all different ways that we might choose to work with learners, I think, in group adult literacy provision, or maybe talk to learners about things they might try themselves. So again, like reading for pleasure, we could see these as, these are real life adult practices of different sorts, but these are also ways that we can use, that we can teach reading in a sense, that we can help develop reading. So that's a little initial overview. I'm now going to try and link those to some insights from 2 research projects that I've worked on over the past 10 years. So one was looking very specifically at reading circles and its relationship with adult literacy teaching. And another more recent one was trying to look at and record really what are the different types of reading aloud that adults might do these days. And the project says Britain because my kind of geographical scope in terms of where I was collecting data was Scotland, Wales and England. But I'd love to do it in other places as well. And a lot of, I think what I found applies to many contexts. So I'm going to now try and link these. So thinking of reading circles, I've also said here on the slide, book groups, book clubs, there's different names I think we can call these things. And there's definitely differences in practice, there's slight differences, but I think there's enough in common that we might agree there is a kind of a thing that happens, and it happens in many different places, where people get together to talk about a book, a poem, something they've read. And thinking there are some common characteristics, even though there may be many differences. So overall, I think there's something about it being non-hierarchical, that there's not one boss or not constant boss, one kind of constant boss, it's not the same person. So it's something quite adult about it, something shared. That there's a kind of turn taking, that there is a written text involved, whether people read it elsewhere and come back to talk about it, or whether people are actually reading together, perhaps aloud. But really importantly, that is a discussion. People are really driven to talk about what they've read. And this happens in homes, in libraries, in community centres, in pubs, in parks, from what I've found all over the world. And for as long as people have been reading. That in itself is quite interesting, that there's some people, not everyone, but some people really want to do this. And then I have a last question here on the slide, you know, have you taken part? So we can't have a kind of discussion really on this right now, although later in the session, but you might want to think about, have you taken part in reading circles or book groups? Have you led them? Do you know people who have? Do you have any sense of like why they do them? Thinking now about, okay, what if we wanted, so this is one example of reading for pleasure and reading together. That's partly why I'm looking at it here. If you wanted to, if we wanted to run one, maybe as part of adult literacy provision in a session or connected to it, perhaps in a library or community centre, what are the kinds of questions we might be thinking about? One might be thinking about where and when. So do you want to have it in the class time? Is that useful because everyone's free? Is that complicated because what if not everyone wants to do it? Is that really why they're there? Is everyone agreed? If you did want to do it in class time, how do you differentiate it from the other part of the session? You might think about what to read. You know, are you with a group of a level where you could tackle a kind of real novel that anyone might read that might have a certain motivation because it's a kind of real novel or a history book or any other kind of book? So that kind of idea of authenticity, sometimes people talk about as important. Or would it be useful to have something that was simplified or written for less confident readers, perhaps like the quick read series or something else, or something further that you've adapted yourself? Does it have to be the same text? I've seen reading circles where everyone has a different type of text, maybe according to their reading confidences or the time they have on a topic. So I saw one about kind of war poetry. People had all different types of text there. Do you read aloud or not? This is something I'll come back to a bit. I found lots and lots of groups where adults want to practice reading out loud, want to read out loud together, but equally there's lots of people who absolutely don't want to do that, and for very good reason. I think we're often very cautious about introducing that, but think, well, how could we manage that? What kind of discussions could we have? And there's also the question about kind of leading it. If we've said that reading circles are something non-hierarchical, something where people are working together, what does that mean if someone in the group is kind of the teacher, and how can you do that? NICE, which was our old kind of England and Wales adult and community education organisation, commissioned me to write a small book about this aimed at teachers and librarians, and it's now available online. So hopefully you've got this link there, you can kind of access it and download it there, which is just a bit more thinking about, you know, these kind of questions if that's of interest. But moving on for a second here now to think about, okay, but why might we want to do that? So what are the potential benefits for anyone, and maybe particularly for adults who are developing their literacy? This is one of the things I tried to do in that reading circles project, to really think about that. So I've tried to outline things here, and I'll talk briefly. One is, I think there is a kind of what we might call a scaffolding in teaching terms, a kind of supportiveness. So if people are sitting around together, perhaps reading aloud, or someone listening and other people following, there's some development there, isn't there, with development in decoding, whether it's the person reading or other people listening and watching. There's a kind of support potentially with vocabulary, with meanings of words, but also with something that I think if you're used to reading longer texts, and this might apply more to fiction, not sure, see what you think, you're making a kind of interpretation, you're making decisions about, oh, I like that person, or I don't trust him, or I don't trust how he's treated her. If you're completely new to that kind of reading, you might be less sure about, okay, am I meant to be making this judgment? On what basis? And a lot of when this is done, this is happening completely inside someone's head, and it's not really shared, and it could seem quite mysterious. So having those kind of conversations together, forming interpretations together by talking about, what did you think about that? Why did you think that character was suspicious? What was going on there? What on earth did that mean? It's enjoyable, hopefully, and it's developing understanding. So it's also modeling the process that's quite often hidden, I think. I think that can be a benefit within literacy teaching. I think it's also in a very real sense, a kind of peer teaching or an exchange of expertise. So I had a really wonderful experience with one of the reading groups I was working with in adult literacy provision, where everyone was really offering something that they were an expert on, and then they were also getting help from others. So I remember the person in the group who was the least confident with her decoding skills, she had a lot of help from others on that. So in a in a sense, many people would have considered her the weakest reader, but she knew a huge amount about hospitals because that's where she'd worked, and that was the setting of what we were reading. And she helped people a lot with making interpretations about what could be going on, how things work. You know, someone else was very, very good at vocabulary and was often sharing, you know, meanings of words that some others hadn't come across. You know, there was someone else who was very good at making interpretations based on the characters and brought in their own personal experience as well. There was others who had just a better memory for things that they'd read in the past. So because of this sense of everyone offering something, it can become very supportive, and potentially some of the stigma maybe of getting certain kinds of help seemed to go because everyone was bringing something in. And similarly, where we may often have provision where there's people who've grown up speaking English or the language of the class, whereas others might be newer to it. And I think sometimes that makes this very difficult to handle as a teacher, because sometimes the needs are quite different of people who are much newer to the language, who might be more language learners really, and more adult literacy learners. And yet I think in a reading circle formation that can work better because of this sense that everyone can be getting what they need from actually what's a group process, but individually differentiated by themselves. So someone who may be newer to the language may be keeping a note of all new vocabulary, whereas someone who's grown up speaking the language but is struggling more with decoding or making interpretations may be concentrating on that. So these are some of the things that I've observed, and the sense that there's a kind of range of texts. So many people talk about joining reading circles because they get a kind of impetus to try out different things, and I think this applies with literacy learners of all different levels as well. A kind of just range of different texts. The more we read, the more we practice different types of decoding different types of words, the more we practice building up different types of meanings. And then that we all, well, many of us like to talk about what we read, and that's a kind of potential benefit. So these are, whoops, I'm going back here. So these are some of the ways that I think this real life practice of book groups, which is a form of reading for pleasure, it's also a form of reading together, can be, we can bring into our adult literacy teaching, whether that's about starting up a particular book group or whether it's about taking particular aspects from it there. And you can think of each of these benefits relating back to, if I flick back here, to our list of how we might understand reading to be, the challenges, the individual skills. We could develop all of these in that act there. Now, reading out loud. So this was the topic of the second project that I think to me also has a great deal to do with reading for pleasure and reading together. So it started with this question, okay, us as adults, do we read out loud? If so, when, where, why? And I wanted to ask that because I got more and more the feeling that lots of adults did, but we don't seem to talk about it much. So I think there's things we do with reading that get a lot of press, that get talked about a lot, and there's others that don't seem to get talked about. So if you looked up reading aloud online, various internet searches, you'd probably get a lot on reading to children, which is nice and important, but it's not the only thing that we do as adults. And that was the basis of the project. So this question here I have for you, what's the last time you read something out loud? So that is a question for you to think about, and that's what I was really doing with the project. I've put the project website here, and in a second I'll also flick to the project web page because there's some materials on there that could be interesting. So I didn't go into this project thinking specifically about either reading for pleasure or reading together, but that ended up being something that came out a lot. So it was a project that had there was a survey that people, it was Wales, Scotland, England survey. Some people took part in. There was about 500-600 people took part in that. There was mass observation, which is something run by the University of Sussex, where about 500 people get directives, which are kind of lists of questions, through their door a couple of times a year, and then they respond in writing all their thoughts and feelings, all very private. A very interesting kind of research. I also did interviews with people, and I made audio recordings. And it's hard to sum up a 2-year research project in a couple of minutes, which I'm going to try and do. But the main thing I found is that adult reading aloud is something people do. Not everyone maybe, but plenty of people do forms of reading aloud, so it's very widespread. But it's often not noticed. So a really common thing I found is people saying, oh, I thought I didn't read out loud, but the more I think about it, the more I found I do. Or I thought I didn't, but my husband said actually I do it all the time without realizing. Or my wife says I do it all the time without realizing. Or my partner. Or lots of comments like that, and incredibly diverse. So people reading out loud completely alone to understand a complicated text, or to write something, or to edit something. People reading to other people in a shop when they've forgotten their glasses, or reading the back of ingredients. People reading aloud recipes as part of their cooking to reinforce it, to remember, have I done that? Have I done that? People reading aloud instructions when they're building something flat pack. People reading aloud prayers and holy books for religious purposes, alone or with other people. People reading aloud graffiti from a toilet door. There was a man who said he reads aloud to his wife because it's the only way that it relieves her constipation. Just all kinds of things. And what surprised me the most is people reading aloud completely alone. And across all different parts of our lives. So for work, lots of reading aloud, and working life, reading aloud of minutes. There was a pharmacist who talked to me about the reading aloud they have to do a stock take to check different things, and for different reasons. So to memorize things, to understand things, for the joy and the pleasures of language, to communicate something to other people, to be there for someone, to hear a voice, and in different languages. So once again, this is something that people do in their lives. Not everyone, but some people do, and they get a great deal out of. But it's also something I think that we can harness. So I thought for a while whether it would be worth trying to play some recordings, because there's lots of just really amazing people talk about what they do, but I'll show you on the website where you can listen, and they're also in the British Library Sound Archive there. But I've just got a few extracts here. I'm actually not going to read aloud this one, if that's okay. I'll let you look at that. So this seems to be an example, doesn't it, of reading together, and a kind of reading for pleasure. It's reading what they want to, when they want to, why they want to. It seems interesting from paper as well as electronic. And a kind of reading very much integrated, would you think, into a kind of a bit of family life? Maybe quite a kind of everyday bit of family life that's in there. And another example here, of another type of reading together. It's a much sadder example. There are actually quite a lot of examples like this. Well, sad and happy. Lovely way, I guess, to be together with someone there. So there are many examples that maybe we can talk about if you're interested. But for now, I think it's probably useful for us to think about, okay, but what does this mean, if anything, for literacy teaching? So if this is about real life practices, and if I'm saying that it seems a lot of people do forms of reading aloud, which is also potentially ways to be together with other people, what could we take from that as literacy teachers? And I tried to collect some of these up here. I'm just looking at my time there. And one thing, it seems that it can help to the hearing words and seeing them at the same time. That can help with a kind of decoding. And there may even be a tripleness. So sometimes you might be saying something, hearing it and seeing it. And there's lots of different ways. If we think about how people have learned to read historically or across different places and time periods, it's often been with a text that they've known by heart. In many places, this was a form of the Lord's Prayer, for example. They know that text by heart. It's already in their head, and then they're linking it to the written text. So there's something about the saying, the seeing, and the hearing which can support with decoding. It can be a way of being with others, and that's a reason or a motivation. So sometimes I think what we do as literacy teachers is also think about motivations, or think about why people might want to read out loud, or why, if they're trying to understand, or why people might want to read, and that the idea of it being a way of being with others, that's a way to read in itself. For me, it's also important that it's a reminder that reading isn't just something that has to be done alone. and it doesn't have to be something that's done unsupported. And to be kind of good at reading, if we want to use that term, or to have reading as part of your life, doesn't mean you have to be the expert at all of it. It might be that you're listening to someone read, and that's you're taking part in that reading practice, or that you're mainly listening and you're doing some reading aloud. So that reading is, I think reading is not just being the one who does the decoding, it's also taking part in something bigger. It could be a way to share our love of reading. So people who work in reading instruction with teenagers often talk about this, that if they feel they have what they might call reluctant readers, that some forms of finding a way to read out loud a kind of really interesting story or text can become a hook, and they'll, particularly if they enjoy listening to it, they might enjoy talking about it, and then the actual decoding or the actual being the reader themselves bit can follow. That our reading practices in one domain can support those in others. I suppose you may have found working with learners that someone might feel, I can't really read much at all, but actually they're doing lots of reading in one context, and we can show what they're doing there and help that to build other skills. And it can help to build reading confidence. So I've put this can in bold because I think we do need to be careful about that, because certainly there are many people who felt they've been humiliated at school or things from people forcing them to read out loud. And that there is a certain paradox, if that's the right word, in that many people I spoke to who were also adult literacy learners as well, and adult literacy teachers, felt that the learners felt that it really helps their confidence to read something out loud, and can help their confidence also in making presentations and feeling like they can read. But I think often that first needs to be practiced alone or with a very supportive group that they feel really comfortable with, because being put on the spot and having to read something for the first time out loud in a group of people, for any of us, no matter how confident we are, can be very daunting. So it's trying to work around those kind of catch-22s of finding a way that someone can feel they can practice in a safe environment, and if they want to do it as well. So there's some discussions I can show you in a second. Actually, I might flip here now if I can. If you can see this now, this is the project website, and on here, and I will stop talking in just a sec, there's something that says resources for discussion, reflection, next steps. So for example, there's a one I did at an adult education centre in Wales. So these are some points here, if I'm lucky and this opens, that the members of the group there found that, okay, it can help build our confidence. It might help sometimes with punctuation. These are some things to bear in mind, including this issue of confidence. We don't want to feel nervous and then we'll rush. So I won't look at this in too much detail now, but I'll just show you where it is and I can come back to that. But that may be something it was intended to be helpful to generate discussions there. So just to end then, to try and sum up, what I've been trying to talk about, I think, is that forms of reading for pleasure and forms of reading aloud and other ways of reading together, I think are real life. They're things that people do. All different people do them in different ways, but they're also a way we can approach the teaching. To remember this idea of reading for pleasure, because you choose to, how you choose, where you choose, what you choose, and that we can try and be part of showing people the way that reading can be part of something bigger. I think one challenge for me is that I never want to be part of something where I'm trying to tell someone, oh, you should be doing this because it's good for you, or these people love reading these certain novels, therefore you have to do that as well, because they might not want to. Why do they have to do that? But to show that, well, some people get something out of doing these kind of things. You know, you might too. A big part of it is togetherness, different ways of being together. I mean, thinking now in these kind of COVID-y times, there's been some kind of reading aloud online, or people recording their voices for other people. It might not really make up for not being with someone in the flesh, but it's something about the voice is quite important. And the reading aloud can be part of reading for pleasure. This idea of scaffolding, so I'm skipping about here, but that reading aloud and listening to others read can be a way to support various different skills that we might see are involved in reading. And I think that's quite important, because we want to find different ways to build these skills and different ways to make it interesting. And the one, remember when I did the breakdown of what reading can involve at the very beginning? I mean, one thing that wasn't there, and is actually rarely there when we see breakdowns of reading, is anything about the voice. But given that reading aloud is something some people do, at least some of the time, for that, how you use your voice is a big part of the skill. And I thought that's worth mentioning today, because I've known many adult literacy learners who feel they're really struggling with reading with decoding, but are amazing storytellers and have amazing use of voice. And to recognize that that in itself is a skill that then they can apply to their reading when they're confident enough, I think can sometimes be very motivating. And just to help us remember, reading can mean very different things to different people. So it's always worth asking and talking to people about what kinds of things they want to read, why, what's important to them, and how. And I think that's probably where I should stop. Does that sound right, Fergus?
Yes, Sam. Yeah, that was lovely and fantastic and really interesting. I could totally see when you talked about the benefits of reading aloud, the confidence element. I could absolutely understand that. So yeah, that was really great, really thought-provoking, and we could see all the other elements that you opened from your work in Wales, etc. Everything came through okay. So that was great.
Great. So there's more there.
A little echo from me. I hope that doesn't continue.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sam. I really enjoyed that. You're a bit inspired. Sorry about the echo.